All right. Hello, everybody. I'm reminded as I'm looking out over all of you today that when I was in high school, my English teacher, whose name was Mr. Lugadamo, pulled me aside to give me some advice at one point. And what he said, and I quote, was, "Ryan, if you ever have to give a speech, make sure you start with a quote." So there we go. Mission accomplished already. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see so many folks after lunch. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to spend some time with you all here in Tacoma today. I just want to thank, if any of them are in the room, the organizers of Housing Washington for inviting me to join you all here. I'm very aware of how much housing expertise and knowledge is in this room right now, and so I don't take this opportunity lightly. My name is Ryan Watt, and I am here wearing two hats. Hat number one is from my day job, where I am the strategy lead for international large-scale change at Community Solutions, and that is probably about 80% of my time, so I want you to imagine like a quite large hat that represents that one. The other 20% is from my nights and weekends job, which is as the executive director of a small nonprofit based in Seattle called The Urbanist, which advocates for housing abundance. Fabulous. Can you raise your hands if you read The Urbanist, actually?
Every day.
Amazing. Well, thank you for being readers. That's about 20% of my time, so it's a much smaller hat that represents that. I'm going to try to blend lessons from both of those things and also cut down on the number of jokes. This is setting a pace that I can't keep up. But we're going to move forward from here. I like to start these things by talking a little bit about why you should care what I have to say, why it's worth listening at all. So I just want to talk a little bit about what Community Solutions does, because it sounds like many of you are familiar with The Urbanist. Community Solutions is probably best known for running the Built for Zero initiative since 2015, which is an initiative that is working to demonstrate that homelessness is solvable one community at a time. We work with about 107 communities around the country, trying to help them reach functional zero homelessness for a population of people experiencing it. And since we launched in 2015, 14 of the communities we work with have reached zero for a population. And that number is actually out of date since I put this slide deck together. We announced 2 weeks ago in DC that Charlottesville, Virginia has ended veteran homelessness. And so we're now at 15 communities at zero. No round of applause for that? Yeah, there we go. Short one, though. I lead our work outside of the United States, which is working to help leaders in other countries stand up initiatives like Built for Zero in their countries. So we have partnerships with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness and Built for Zero Canada, our partners in Denmark named Gymnosninger, partners in France, which I will not try to attempt, partners at the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness, and partners in the United Kingdom with Crisis, which just recently launched Built for Zero UK. 7 communities in those countries have also reached zero, bringing the total to 22. I've been asked to use the time I have with you today to reflect on this really simple statement, that homelessness is solvable. That homelessness is solvable, and I'll add this part myself, that we therefore have an obligation to solve it. And when I received that prompt from the organizers and started to think about it a little bit in the context of talking with all of you, I began to be curious about a related question. What would it look like to inhabit a world in which nobody would think to ask someone to reflect on this statement? What would it take to make homelessness as solvable a statement as obvious as the observation that the sky is blue or that the Mariners are only going to make the playoffs every 20 years? What would it take to get there? In short, those are laughs of pain. What will it take to demonstrate that homelessness is solvable? So this talk is my attempt to answer that question. And at the risk of spoiling the rest of my speech, I want to summarize my answer right here at the outset because I'll come back to this framing. I believe that we can demonstrate that homelessness is solvable if we do 4 things. Number 1, implement really smart systems work that asks the right questions and looks at the right data. Number 2, shift the public narrative around our issue by tackling unsheltered homelessness first with vigor and with visible success. Number 3, build a broad and powerful coalition, as Representative Schopp walks into the room, centered on solutions, not on problems. And number 4, keep the faith in ourselves and in our work. So I'd like to tackle each of these questions in turn. And to begin with, I'd like to tell you the story of and share some lessons from the Built for Zero initiative run by Community Solutions, where I work, and through which those 22 communities across the US and around the world have reached functional zero homelessness for either veterans or for people experiencing chronic homelessness, or both. And this really is the story of learning how to ask the right questions. So let's begin. As you now know, Built for Zero is this national initiative, 107 American, more than 70 international communities that I support, working towards an end to homelessness for a population of people experiencing it. In the US, that's veterans and people experiencing chronic homelessness, but in our international partner initiatives, they're working for an end to youth homelessness, an end to rough sleeping, an end to family homelessness as well. Again, of the 170 communities working to end it, 22 have reached zero. That's a really good start, and it's work that I'm proud of, but it's not enough, because thanks to an incredibly transformative gift from the MacArthur Foundation in 2021, we are now working to get 75 communities to zero by July 31st, 2026. Put a line in the sand as to where we're going to do it. And I think we might just get there. There's, in the US, 60 more communities we need to get to zero, and that's just 3 years away, a little bit less than 3 years away. But it hasn't been easy, and it took a lot of failure to even get to the point where we are today, where we can receive this incredibly humbling investment. It took learning to ask the right questions. So the story of Built for Zero begins in New York City in the early 1990s, where our founder, Roseanne Haggerty, and her organization, which was then called Common Ground Communities, were engaged in an effort to build permanent supportive housing for people experiencing chronic homelessness, starting around Times Square, but moving to the rest of New York really rapidly. And as many of you in this room will know or will recall from having worked in the sector at that time, the climate then was still one in which housing first was not the standard in our sector. And there was still widespread skepticism of the idea that housing and services should be the standard of care for people experiencing homelessness and our most vulnerable neighbors. So Common Ground was really fighting against that rising tide at that moment, and they were good at what they did, which at that point was mostly hotel conversions. You see them here at the 400 to 600 unit scale. And the organization won some national recognition and got some awards during the early 2000s. Roseanne herself got one of those MacArthur Genius Grants that go around, and I do think she is actually a genius. But underneath that visible success was a really unsettling and really persistent reality, which was that despite the fact that Common Ground was winning all these awards, despite the fact that they were opening all these buildings, their staff were walking past people experiencing homelessness every day on the route to their buildings. And when they tried to house them in the buildings that they operated, they found that their own processes, their own rules and processes that they put into place with the best of intentions and to meet program and grant requirements had made it nearly impossible to bring some of those most difficult to house neighbors inside, especially with any kind of speed. The systems they built were horrifically slow. They weren't serving those most in need, even as Common Ground was getting all this recognition. To put it really simply, they were succeeding at running great programs, but failing at their mission. And so in early 2010, Roseanne and the team decided to do something about it. And this is why I think she's a genius, because she is always ready to pivot based on what isn't working. In early 2010, Roseanne and the team decided to set a fairly audacious goal. They wanted to house 100,000 highly vulnerable individuals across the country, veterans and people experiencing chronic homelessness, through community-level system change focused on tearing down the barriers to placing people in permanent and stable housing. 100,000 people is a lot of people, of course, when even one person experiencing homelessness is, in my view, a moral crisis. But if you're used to building 400 unit or 600 unit buildings, it also feels manageable. It felt like something we could do. The idea was that if we housed 100,000 people experiencing homelessness through a determined, focused grassroots campaign, and there were, at that point, only about 100 or 1,000 or so chronically homeless people in the entire country, which is what the best data we had at the time suggested, we should go a long way towards solving the problem. So what happened? So by the time the curtain came down on the 100,000 Homes campaign, the organization, which by that point was called what it is today, Community Solutions, had supported 186 communities across the country in helping 108,000 people move from homelessness into permanent housing. A massive achievement, and by the terms of the campaign's name, a success. But, and here's the catch, of the 186 communities, none, zero, had ended homelessness for good. And chronic homelessness had only gone down nationwide by about 20%. There's a math problem there. If we thought There were only 100,000 people experiencing homelessness in the country. We housed 108,000 people, and the number went down by 20%. Something was wrong. It was an embarrassing setback, especially for an organization that made a point of inviting reporters to both the launch event and the event where we said we'd house 108,000 people. So, what happened? As Roseanne and the team pondered that question, they came to this conclusion, basically that they hadn't asked the right question. Homelessness is a wicked problem. I've worked in shelters for people experiencing homelessness. I know many of you have as well. And you know how wickedly it lands on the bodies and the minds of the people who's experiencing it. It's incredibly dangerous. We have to end it. But it's also a wicked problem in the sense that the tools we're used to using to solve social problems, or even more straightforward technical problems, where we have much better data about the nature, tools like once annual reviews, 5-year strategies, 10-year plans, they're simply inadequate to the task. Homelessness is different. The particular nature of the problem changes so quickly in the people who are homeless that particular day, in the things they need from your system, and even in the nature and staffing of the system that you have working to solve the problem, that by the time you're finished making your long-term plan or your 5-year strategy, it's already out of date. You can't get away with spending 18 months writing a strategic plan that once it's published sits on a shelf gathering dust. I have written strategic plans that I think I was one of 10 readers for. That is not going to work. You need to be able to pivot faster, to be able to write the plan as you go and update it with better data as you gain that data through experience. So this was the basic challenge that the CS team ran into. The original question we'd asked, of course, was how can we house 100,000 highly vulnerable people by making it easier to place folks into housing? And in answering that question, the team had been laser focused on a single activity, which was increasing the number of people communities were placing into housing. They were focused on that activity rather than on what we were trying to achieve, which was ultimately an end to homelessness. And that meant that while communities were focusing on getting their housing placement rate up, more and more people were entering into homelessness all the time, and they didn't have a way to keep their eyes on it. To summarize, we hadn't set the right goal, and we weren't measuring what we actually cared about. That insight, that we'd failed pretty dramatically, led Roseanne and the team to a very different question. It's the one you see here on screen. So if the question underlying 100,000 homes was, how can we house 100,000 people? The question the team began asking themselves after 100,000 homes wrapped up was this one. Are all of our programs and investments adding up to the thing that we really want, which is equitable reductions in homelessness over time? And if not, how quickly would we know that? And how quickly could we pivot? Hence Built for Zero, which launched in 2015. The fundamental premise of this campaign is the simple idea that if we put our aim, zero homelessness, at the center of our work, and then learn fast and pivot quickly about what it's going to take to get there, we stand a real chance of beating this thing. This sounds simple. It is simple. I don't want you to try to work through in your head how it's like more complicated than what you see on screen. It's very simple, but it is in fact very different from the way we usually approach solving society's problems, by focusing on delivering specific contracts for specific outputs like a certain number of beds, a certain number of meals served, a certain number of nights provided, working alone, rather than working to deliver a certain outcome working together. It's not rocket science, but it's certainly not standard either in the way that we deliver our social programs in this country. Every Built for Zero community starts by committing to a shared aim. Every Built for Zero community builds a team of leaders from around the community to be collectively accountable to that problem. Every Built for Zero community builds a real-time by-name feedback loop that helps them understand how many people are experiencing homelessness in their community at that time. Ideally updated every week, but at minimum updated every month and much more often than that. And every Built for Zero community, once they've got their aim and their measurement system, constantly changes their strategy in light of what they're seeing in their data. It's this last point that's really critical. In Built for Zero communities, strategies and tactics follow from aims, not the other way around. And what connects them is learning. If what we were doing now was adequate to the task of ending homelessness, we'd have already done it. But we haven't, and so we're gonna have to change. And we've tried to put that insight at the center of how we approach our work. I emphasize this point because so many of the systems that we spend our lives inside, so many of the systems I've spent my life inside, are not designed to reward or to encourage learning. We're expected to get it right the first time or lose our job or our contract or our respect within the sector. But this work is hard, and we have to be ready for the fact that what we think will work now won't survive first contact with reality. And we need to start acting with a bias towards action in order to generate more data that we can use to improve our plans as we go along. The basic model that we've tried to apply to generate learning from reality is called the Model for Improvement, which was taught to us by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, which has used it to run successful public health campaigns around the world. So you've seen this, for example, in Jimmy Carter's Racing the Last Guinea Worm to be the last to die, the campaign to eradicate the guinea worm, malaria, all running off of this model. The basics of the model will be familiar to you because they are, in the abstract, exactly what we learned in the concrete through the 100,000 Homes campaign. The model's premised on the idea that when you're solving these complex, constantly changing problems like homelessness, you have to start with a measurable end state and then work backwards to what you're going to do about it. So you start from the left and you move from the right. Once you know what your aim is, that's the green box there, what you're trying to accomplish, you can move to the second part, which is how will we know if any change we make to a system is an improvement? That involves developing a measurement strategy. And then and only then to the third part, which is what changes can we make to our system that might result in an improvement. You then test those ideas over and over and over again. That's the plan, do, study, act cycle that you see on the right of the screen. We run hundreds of small tests of change to our system and hope that these will ultimately add up to reductions all the way to zero. And that is ultimately how those 15 in the US and 22 worldwide have gotten there. Inbuilt for zero communities, the measurable end state, I'll go back here, is what we call functional zero, which is a standard under which a community has demonstrated that it can reliably and rapidly house every person who falls into homelessness every month, and that the total number of people experiencing homelessness overall is vanishingly close to literal zero. It acknowledges that although we can't end poverty outright, though we should, we can build a homelessness response system that can rapidly meet everyone who falls into homelessness with housing and move them into it, and that the total number of people in our communities experiencing homelessness is as close to literal zero as possible. You can talk for hours about the specifics of the definition, but the point and the reason we came up with this is that it is a clear, measurable end state for a community to work towards, so they will know what they're trying to get to, and they'll know whether they've gotten there. Once you set your aim, which in our communities is this functional zero, you need a way to know whether you're getting closer to that aim or farther away from it. Too many communities still track their progress on measuring homelessness through once-a-year point-in-time counts. I know because in my previous job as a social policy researcher, I managed the point-in-time count process for HUD. So whenever communities collected their data, it went to my laptop, and the team that we were working on put the report together. It's my finest work, I think. That's one of the ones with 10 readers. But just as you wouldn't check the weather, which is another complicated system only once a year, you can't track homelessness that way either. And so we help communities build a data system that will allow them to track at least 6 key inflow and outflow data points in real time, or again, as close to real time as possible, so that they know every person experiencing homelessness in their community by name and can begin the hard human work of housing them. That work doesn't happen overnight, but by working through a scorecard that helps them assess where the quality of their data system is, communities can get a sense of whether they've got the kind of measurement system they need to really tackle homelessness, and they can begin tracking data month over month, week over week, fortnight over fortnight, and building strategies against it. So this is Albuquerque in New Mexico. And that brings us to the final part of the model for improvement. You have your aim, you know how a change might result in improvement to your system, then you have to test the question of what changes can we make to our system that might result in an improvement? What changes can we make that will lower the number of people experiencing homelessness in this community? And that in turn begs the question of we. In too many communities, the homelessness response system looks a little bit like this, where the person or family seeking help, that's up in the top left corner for those who are in the back, is left bewildered, left behind, left to navigate this system on their own. Everyone's doing their own thing, and although there's good work happening, the overall picture is one in which homelessness continues to persist. We try to help communities build a single integrated command center where every person at that table knows what they're bringing to the conversation. They know that they're accountable to that shared aim, and they're accountable to that same measurement strategy that we just talked about. They can understand whether their changes are adding up to an improvement. We also try to help communities build a shared governance structure that situates that team I just talked about, the improvement team in the bottom left here, in the context of an executive community leadership group up at the top, capable of clearing major policy barriers out of the way, and the service coordination or case conferencing group in the bottom right That's key to actually moving people into housing, understanding what this person in front of you will need in order to stay safely and stably housed. So here, a case study is probably a little bit helpful. This is the run chart, or the data from Chattanooga, which is a team that successfully achieved functional zero for veterans experiencing homelessness. And the story you see here, right towards the middle of the screen and between February and May of 2018, is that the team had put a lot of effort into improving case conferencing in their community, getting the right people to the table, making sure that they were braiding funding streams, doing all that work that can be hard to do when our sector, which is not always the easiest to play nice in, gets working. So they made some progress, but then you can see towards the end of the summer, the numbers started bumping back up again. So their question became like, why is this happening? We've made some improvements. They've clearly resulted in change in our system, but what are we seeing here? And when they looked at their detailed inflow and outflow data, they told the story. The team had become really good at moving these veterans from homelessness into housing. But a lot of those veterans were flowing back into homelessness a couple of months after they'd been placed into housing. So in their haste to really accelerate their housing placement rate, they maybe hadn't put as much energy or investment into the supports that the veterans needed to stay housed. So they were able to target some resources and support and training towards that, and happily they reached functional zero in February of 2019. The point isn't that that story is going to be the story of every community. The point is that although we know that there are things that work in a lot of places, what works in each community is going to be specific to that community's needs. And unless you have data that can tell you whether what you're doing in your community is working at the aggregate level, you're not going to be able to make progress that'll allow you to get all the way down to zero. So this is the story that's been repeated these 22 times since we launched in 2015. And the strategies and tactics that our communities use are not groundbreaking, nor are they especially novel. They're all things that you all know how to do in this room. In important ways, they're in fact extremely simple, and I try to emphasize that point because I don't want to make this sound more complicated than it is. But I emphasize again that they are not the standard in the vast majority of communities across the United States, or indeed around the world. And I've seen firsthand through my work leading a team to spread this methodology in Australia and Denmark, France, the UK, and Canada, that they can be genuinely transformational, even in places where the broader social safety net is in much better state of repair than it is here in the US. I'll tell you, you've been a very nice audience. I was in London last week talking to the Brits about this, and there is not a big appetite for American opinions about social safety net in the UK. So I had my work cut out for me there, but people hear this, they listen, and they take action. So what does this all add up to, and what's the catch? So I want to start talking about this, the catch here a little bit, because the story I've told so far is one that's really positive, that hinges on these solutions that we've demonstrated that can work in a lot of different places. But I think that there's important yes ands to be said here, and that's what I want to talk about for the rest of my time. So although I'm of course biased to some degree, I think that a fair assessment of Built for Zero would suggest that we've demonstrated that at least in a certain type of community and under a certain set of conditions, homelessness is solvable already today. The communities that have reached functional zero homelessness range from relatively small places like Rockford, Illinois, or Medicine Hat, Alberta, to mid-sized places like Bakersfield, California, or London, Ontario, or Charlottesville, Virginia, which got there 2 weeks ago. At the same time, major cities like Detroit, Charlotte, DC, are making major reductions, 60%, 70% in the number of veterans experiencing homelessness. In each of these places, setting that shared goal, building a really good data system, and testing little rapid changes to the system has shown progress in making deep reductions in homelessness. And in fact, I'm convinced that there's a large number of places with relatively low housing costs where smart systems approaches like Built for Zero can result in reductions in homelessness. I am not convinced that in places where the cost of housing is too high, though, where someone working full-time at minimum wage just can't afford a studio apartment without spending their entire paycheck on it, I'm not convinced that in those places all the systems reform in the world will do anything to solve the underlying issue, which is that the rent is too damn high. So this is another way of saying what we all in this room know to be true. And let me pause here for a second, because I do think that there are hundreds of places around the country where we can get to zero today. And there's part of me that wakes up in the morning and says, I should be spending my life finding all of those places and getting them to zero, because there are people dying on the streets in those places today. but we live in, Seattle or Tacoma or around the rest of the state of Washington. We know that there are places that it's going to take a little bit more, where the rent is just too damn high. So this is another way of saying what we all already know to be true, which is that homelessness is a housing problem. And although we've achieved great things, I don't think that we at Built for Zero have demonstrated a way of working that's entirely adequate to the task of ending homelessness in places where it's most visibly a public health crisis of the highest order: San Francisco, LA, New York, San Diego. In those places, the scale of the problem is just different, and public cynicism about our ability to demonstrate progress is correspondingly greater. And I don't also mean to take away from the good work that's happening in each of those communities where homelessness is so visibly a crisis. We, you, I, have done good work in those places, and those systems are housing people. But more and more people are being pushed into homelessness every single day due to the ever-increasing cost of housing, and the structural gap that creates between people flowing out of homelessness and people flowing into homelessness can't be fully solved by better systems work, to increase the rate at which we're housing people out of homelessness. We genuinely do need more and cheaper housing to stop people from falling into homelessness in the first place. So why aren't we building more of it? And I'm so glad so many of you read The Urbanist, because you're going to see where I'm going with this. This question of why we aren't building more of it brings me to the second part of the 4 points I promised you in the beginning, which is that I think we need to really shift the narrative. My theory is that a big reason that most of the general public doesn't actually believe, my theory that the reason we're not building more housing is that most of the general public don't actually believe or understand that homelessness is a housing problem. And they also don't believe that our current efforts to end homelessness are working. I think we have, in other words, as a homelessness sector, a credibility problem. And this is something I see every day in reactions to articles that we publish at The Urbanist. To many of us in this room, I'm sure the truth of the statement that homelessness is a housing problem is self-evident. We know that many of the people that we serve have otherwise stable lives, and then it's a car breakdown or a health crisis or a lost job or paycheck that pushes them over the edge and into homelessness. But for many of our neighbors who don't work in this field, the only kind of homelessness they register, I am convinced, is visible homelessness, and in particular, homelessness that presents as dirty or addicted or mentally unwell. They simply don't see the huge portion of people experiencing homelessness who just need a little bit of help, a hand up from a neighbor, and maybe a more affordable rent. We have two homelessness crises in this country. We have a visible one and an invisible one. Sheltered people who we know to be, in fact, the majority of people experiencing homelessness, these people are, I think, genuinely invisible to most of our house neighbors. And I think this invisibility leads the general public, in turn, to adopt extremely poor intuitions about what causes homelessness. Specifically, I think it leads them to reverse the causality of the relationship between addiction and mental health crises and homelessness, and to assume that these pathologies cause homelessness when, in fact, we know that they're often caused by someone's experience of homelessness. And I don't think that our sector has taken this problem of the general misperception of the nature of homelessness within the general public seriously enough. In fact, I think that we have made a really dangerous error by failing to engage with the overwhelming political importance of unsheltered homelessness to the political problem of ending homelessness overall, and importantly, to the political problem of building more housing so that we can do that durably in places like Seattle. Some on the political left, and I consider myself on the political left, seem to believe, either explicitly through their words or implicitly through their actions, that if we just let the problem get visibly worse, that'll cause the general public to recognize the scale of the crisis and vote for solutions, the policies and politicians that will resolve things. And in fact, I believe that the reverse is true, that visible homelessness turns voters into reactionaries, and it causes them to turn into a defensive crouch. And the reason for this, I think, is that most people don't think about homelessness every day, the way I do and the way some of you do. They think about it when they see someone experiencing homelessness on the street, when they're walking their child to school, when they're walking to work, when they're trying to have a meal at a restaurant. And their reaction in that moment is not to interrogate the broader social systems and structures that have brought that person into a place where they obviously don't want to be. Their reaction is fear. And fear is not a mindset in which people are receptive to facts. Fear is a mindset when people are receptive to criminalization, incarceration, and sweeps. We need to change the narratives to give ourselves more of a fighting chance, because people don't believe us right now when we say that homelessness is a housing problem. So how do we do that? I think we in this room know that punitive approaches will do really nothing to solve the underlying problem of homelessness, which we understand correctly, in my view, to be one of high rents relative to low wages and a catastrophically underfunded social safety net. But I say again that we have not taken seriously enough how easy we have made it for reactionary politicians to make the case that we have no idea what we're talking about. When we say that homelessness is a housing problem to a general public whose primary engagement with homelessness is someone who's out of their mind in that moment, leering at them on the street, we're asking them to ignore the evidence of their own eyes over the evidence of our spreadsheets, and this will not work. So at this point, I think I'm obligated to be really specific about what I think this means in terms of practical actions, things that we should do for how we as a sector should act. And I think one of those implications that we could stand to invest a lot more in public communications campaigns about the root causes of homelessness, and maybe even in publications like The Urbanist that are trying to tell this story. Another, I think, is that we should devote disproportionate energy and effort to eliminating visible forms of unsheltered homelessness, and that we should be far more open to standing up large amounts of temporary shelter than we have been for the last 30 years to do it. This approach, incidentally, is not all that different from what Houston has done through Street to Home, although Houston, unlike us here in the Puget Sound region, has also taken steps like removing zoning barriers to generate housing abundance. And as a parenthetical here, this agenda of housing abundance, this agenda of removing permitting barriers and zoning reforms cannot be a niche issue of urbanists. It has to be a cause of the entire housing sector. But I'll come back to my main point, which is that I think we need to devote disproportionate resources to focusing on the problem of visible, unsheltered homelessness. And I recognize that whenever anyone advocates for focusing scarce resources, and they are scarce in our sector, on one particular population of people experiencing homelessness, a lot of folks get really concerned that this means that other groups will be left behind. Please understand that, in my view, every form of homelessness is a moral catastrophe, and work to address any one of them is, in some sense, morally worthy. But I also think that the concrete situation facing our sector is that we have too little power and too little money to solve all forms of homelessness all at once. And my evidence for that is that we are trying to solve all forms of homelessness at once, and homelessness still exists. So I think the important practical question in front of us is what area of focus, what area of attention is most likely to generate more power, more resources, a virtuous cycle for us as a sector, so that we can subsequently deploy those resources and those power to tackling the forms of homelessness that we understand to be at the root of the problem. What approach, in other words, will shift our narrative from scarcity, which is the one we have now, to abundance? To me, again, the clear answer is focusing overwhelmingly and first on the problem of unsheltered homelessness, demonstrating to the public visible progress on solving the only kind of homelessness they viscerally understand will, I hope, give us the political space to organize for the resources we'll need to finish off this problem for good. When homelessness is visible, it and crime, which I think for most voters are interchangeable in their heads, I don't think they distinguish between crime and homelessness, they dominate the agenda for people running for local office. And these issues being top of mind prime voters to vote for right-wing candidates who in general don't want to fund the kind of reforms that we know will actually lower the numbers of people experiencing most forms of homelessness, or even defund the services that we do know work. By contrast, when homelessness isn't dominating the agenda, when it isn't the top thing voters are thinking about when they're going to the ballot box, progressive candidates have space to run on other issues and win, and then space to vote for the kinds of things that progressives always vote for, housing and services. Over the last couple of decades, and I talked about this when I talked about Roseanne's work to spread housing first principles in New York in the 90s, our sector has come to widely adopt these housing first principles, founded, I think, on the indisputably correct basis that imposing entry requirements for housing on the basis of drug use and employment make it extremely hard for someone to have the solid foundation on which they need to rebuild their lives. They need a safe place to call home, and I'm not calling that into question. But I also think that these principles have led us as a sector to be really suspicious of temporary shelter and transitional housing programs that, for much of our history, were among the worst offenders in imposing these kinds of requirements on folks. So over the course of decades, we've worked diligently as a sector to transfer funding from old-style emergency shelter and transitional housing programs, and even more broadly from SROs and things like that, to more robust permanent supportive housing programs. And these are programs that generally have substantially lower unit counts than the types of shelter that they replaced. And all the while, rising housing costs have pushed more and more people into homelessness, only now into a sector with far fewer places for them to go. I fear we may have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. I want to be really clear that I understand the impulse away from shelter programs, and I continue to be strongly supportive of the principles of housing first. We should work to remove barriers from housing wherever possible, and nobody wants to replicate the experience of New York City, which has a generations-long crisis in its shelter system. But in cities that fundamentally have no housing for people to move into in this moment, it isn't particularly helpful to say that we should move them into housing first. And given that, as I've said before, I view the primary political problem that we face as focusing on unsheltered homelessness in order to unlock our ability to solve other issues. I'm much more open, I think, than others in our sector to standing up large amounts of temporary shelter and transitional housing in order to reduce visible homelessness. Right now, our homelessness systems that I'm a part of, that I've worked in, are fragmented, underfunded, and overwhelmed, fighting a rising tide with leaking buckets, with tired arms. People are quitting the sector left and right. They are embedded within, working on behalf of, and struggling against, I think, a general public that fundamentally misunderstands the causes of homelessness, and which is willing, and I think increasingly eager, to vote into office politicians who advocate strategies for addressing homelessness that are at best counterproductive, and at worst, I think, genuinely evil. I think the unfortunate truth, again, is that our sector is facing a tremendously dangerous credibility problem with the general public. And this is all the more disappointing because voters have shown what is, in my view, a remarkable willingness to tax themselves at fairly high rates in order to address the problem they see in front of them. Los Angeles is the most obvious example from the last decade or so in the passage of Prop HHH, which was primarily focused on standing up PSH along housing first principles. Well, we're now nearly 8 years into the implementation of this, and I was on the ground in LA when it passed, working on their homelessness system, and fewer than 2,000 units have come online. Fewer than 2,000 units when 100,000 people are homeless on the streets of Los Angeles tonight. And I wonder how many people who voted for HHH also came out in support of the police sweeps of Echo Park Lake last year. How many of those people who voted to tax themselves billions of dollars have seen it turn into almost nothing and are now much more open to the kind of things that kill people? We need to change the narrative, and we need to provide solutions. And this brings me, we're doing great, to the third approach that I think we need to take to demonstrate that ending homelessness is possible after asking the right questions and narrative change. And that is to build coalitions around solutions, not around problems. So what do I mean by this? I mean that to a certain but not unlimited extent, for the purposes of building a coalition for housing abundance, the kind of housing abundance we really need in order to generate a durable end to homelessness, it doesn't really matter why people want to build more housing in Washington, just that they want to build more housing. So here I think an example is useful. So in recent years, a number of prominent scholars, including Leah Rothstein, who, as I understand, gave a talk earlier in this conference, have demonstrated conclusively that the reason zoning and other legal limitations on housing types were put in place is racism. Faced with the prospect of black and brown people moving into parts of the city in which they themselves lived, white leaders in the early part of the 20th century put in place this range of restrictions on housing types, zoning system first among them. And that zoning system limited multifamily housing, historically the cheapest and most dense form of housing, to lower income, disproportionately black and brown people, limited it to certain pockets of the city. And these zoning restrictions, I don't need to tell you if you read The Urbanists, stay in place today and privilege the most expensive types of housing, which are single-family detached homes, over and above the cheaper, denser forms of housing, which are in turn limited to a few limited areas of the city. And this, of course, has a deeply negative effect on housing supply. We simply aren't permitted to build as much housing as we want in the places where people want to live. And changing this, undoing this racist legacy, is a major part of the supply corner, of the supply stabilized and subsidized triangle that the folks in the Washington legislature have been focused on for the last few years. So I'm repeating all of this history, much of which I suspect you already know, and you've heard many times, including at this conference, to make really clear before I make the next point that I emphatically believe that the root cause of much of our housing supply issue is racism. The historical record is too clear. My lived experience as a person of color is too clear not to believe that for generations, people like me weren't allowed to live in the parts of the city where I now live and where I want to start a family. That is a disgrace, and there's many among us, probably many in this room right now, who would say that it's incumbent upon us to share that story as much as we can, far and wide. But for the purposes of winning housing abundance, I'm willing to accept that some people who want dense housing and to end homelessness don't actually buy into the idea that our housing supply issues are at root an issue of racism. And I'm thinking here in particular of some conservatives in the state legislature who voted for last year's missing middle housing package because they want housing costs to come down in their own communities, or they had a particular development that they were focused on there, not because they're particularly focused on ending racism or being anti-racist. People come to housing abundance for their own reasons, and I think that we should welcome them almost whatever those reasons are. So for example, on the other end of the spectrum, many rich white liberals in places like Seattle are deeply concerned about the issue of climate change and can clearly see the cost themselves of continued inaction on that issue. And I think there's a broad political consensus in most of our cities and to some extent in our state that we should take action to address climate change. And it's also really clear, because of the high carbon costs of both cars and of single-family homes, that dense, walkable, housing-abundant cities are low-carbon cities, and that these cities, incidentally, also have a heck of a lot more housing than the ones that we're living in today. So these types of voters who live in one of those luxury single-family homes, are cross-pressured. They both want to help stop climate change by allowing more people to live low-carbon lives, and they want to avoid seeing visible homelessness, but they also have a stake in high housing costs because they live in an expensive home, and they're hoping for the value of that home to go up. If we demonize these people, as some would like to, as the reason for our housing supply crisis, I think we might alienate them. But if we focus on climate as the cause for housing abundance, which they care about, we might build a bigger coalition and achieve greater results. So here in Washington, I think we have some early evidence that this link between climate and housing can be politically productive and can be the basis for coalitions that deliver results. So last year, thanks to the leadership of Representative Jessup Bateman, Representative Chopin, are there any other legislators in the room right now that I should be thanking? Many folks. Washington passed a raft of housing reforms, including missing middle, that collectively should unlock huge amounts of development and do a great deal to drive housing costs down. And Representative Bateman would be the first to tell you, because she told me, that the main reason that this legislation got off the ground, and indeed across the finish line this year, and not in previous years, is that this time, and not in previous times, climate and environmental groups got behind it from the beginning, and so did some Republicans. And they were able to communicate, those groups, to their members the cost of inaction on these issues in terms that mattered to them, in terms that they understood and that they had a stake in, and it worked. My point is not that we should ignore the causes of problems or that we should stop talking about racism. My point is that simply talking about why a problem came into being may not always be the only or the most effective way to solve that problem. In the work of ending homelessness, I'd encourage everyone in our sector to make these smart links between issues around solutions and to be willing to be really flexible in how we communicate to different audiences. That set of housing bills last year passed with some Republican support. That's not an argument against it. That's an argument for accepting allies where we can find it. Not every argument needs to be about every cause. So at this point, I've talked for a really long time, and I'm worried about picking up this glass of water and dropping it, so I'm just going to power through. I've talked about smart system changes like Built for Zero that ask the right questions and generate better data. I've talked about narrative change and why I think it's important. And I've talked about building smart coalitions around solutions, not around problems, and winning allies in the fight for housing abundance. And I want to just close a little bit by talking a little bit more personally. So in the next couple of decades, our region is going to become even more attractive as a place to live, because we're expected to be one of the few places in the continental U.S. that is less affected by climate change. Of course, we are affected. I don't have air conditioning. I noticed, yeah. So nearly 8 million people live in our state today. 40 years ago, it was 4 million. Is there anyone in this room who's willing to bet that by 2065, it'll be anything less than 16 million? The question, in other words, is not whether people will come, whether we'll continue to grow. People will come whether we like it or not. Every 115-degree day in Phoenix will lead another family to pack up the RV and drive north. So the question is not whether they'll come. The question is what kind of communities will be there when they get here. What are we going to be ready to do when people arrive here? And I think it would be really easy for us to become smaller versions of ourselves when faced with the challenge of creating a society that can work for all of us, including the millions that are yet to come here. I think it would be easy for us to hide and to hoard and to lock up the incredible beauty of our region for those who are here now. And there's certainly plenty of examples from around the world of societies who are doing just that, and plenty of our fellow Americans who want us to do that as a country. But I think there's no reason that we need to let other people's bad example guide our own decisions. I am sick and tired of not living in the greatest place in the entire world. And I know that the way that we can make that happen is by unlocking the incredible abundance, the incredible beauty that we have all around us, and build a society where every single one of us has in that staggering abundance the things we need to build lives of meaning and of joy: abundant housing, abundant healthcare, abundant education, food, water, and places for fun. The prospect of building this better world over and above the many, many people experiencing homelessness that I have known and loved and cared about in my life is what motivates me in this work. And so I want, before I wrap up here, to leave you with my final message, which is to keep the faith. I know how hard this work is. I know how difficult it can be, especially if you're working frontline in shelters or if you have lived experience of homelessness or housing insecurity yourself. To believe that the fight is winnable, to believe that we can make the world that we want. But the power of this work, I think, is in what it teaches us about how we want to live together and in the relationships we build with one another as we try to create this world that we want. And that, to me, has been the lesson of Built for Zero. It's been the lesson of the last few years of progress we made here in Washington. And I think ultimately it'll be the lesson that we learn when we reach that world that we're trying to build. I think it'll ask a lot of us. I think it'll ask us to maintain our idealism while simultaneously setting it aside at key moments to make the trade-offs that are going to be necessary to move the ball forward towards justice. It'll ask us to put our egos aside and do whatever it takes to move the cause forward. And that'll be hard, but this isn't about us. This is about the people who are dying right now because they don't have a place to live. We'll screw up, we'll learn, and we'll do better next time. The world of politics, I think, is an uncomfortable place for many of us in the housing world or the homeless world to find ourselves within, particularly if we've kept with us the distaste for moral ambiguity and for distasteful trade-offs that come standard with the idealism that draws many of us into this work in the first place. But I think if we think of politics as the practice of making choices about how we want to live with one another, serious engagement with it is clearly a requirement of making progress towards the world that we want. And so I'm asking you to keep the faith. I think we're all of us here in this work because we have decided that a world in which homelessness exists is not one in which we want to live. And we're here today because we're trying to find the way for our particular hands to generate that world together. So I'll end just by saying, keep the faith, we'll find the strength together. Thank you for sharing some time with me today, and homelessness is solvable. So I think there are a couple of questions in the room, so please leave if you want to, but if you want to stay, you're welcome to. There's one in the back here, yes. I can't hear you very well.
Sorry, I was wondering if you were familiar with the right-of-way program that the Department of Commerce and the Washington State Department of Transportation
Yes.
worked on over the last few years?
Yes.
And if that is a good example of the kind of place-based, targeting visible homelessness and eventually getting encampments down to zero by getting everybody in housing.
Yeah, I mean, I know the specifics of that program matter and how we actually implement it matters, and I think that not all the people who've been moved out of those places are necessarily any safer today than they were at the time that the program was implemented, but I do think it's the right idea and that we should work to improve programs like that.
Yeah, so I'm curious about what specific drawbacks that you can sort of take away from that or how that...
From that particular program?
Yeah, how does what maybe apply to the future program?
Yeah, I mean, I think that programs like that often fall down because they don't take seriously how difficult the work of actually engaging with people currently experiencing homelessness is, how difficult the work of building trust with someone who's been failed by systems over and over and over again is, and our willingness to say if someone has just disappeared that the problem no longer exists for them. I think that we do need to resolve visible homelessness and we do need to help people move into forms of shelter, but we also need to take seriously the fact that if they've just disappeared, that doesn't mean that the problem's gone away.
Thank you so much for your work. This is amazing, and I agree that functional zero is something that everyone should be working towards. My question is more about what the data shows in communities that have been able to reach that functional zero. So we know that homelessness impacts Black and brown folks, much higher levels than it does white folks, and we know that even if they go through the system at the same time, the outcomes for Black people and brown people are probably going to be worse. Like they're not going to be offered the best types of transitional housing. They're not going to get the support they need. Many times that is based on or blamed on bad data, right? Like we just don't have the right information to make sure that we're not being racist. And not looking at the fact that we're using actuarial methods like VI-SPDAT and other things to kind of really put people in boxes and not look at their entire situation. And so my question is, if you're using something data-driven, like the Built for Zero method, do you see better outcomes for Black and brown folks in those systems without, like after they've been overhauled and we're working towards the same goal, or are we still finding that white families and Black families, when they enter the shelter system, white families still are coming out of it?
Yeah, really great question, and a question that we have a national evaluator now working to evaluate Built for Zero as a whole. It was a requirement of the MacArthur funding, and it's one of the questions they're looking at. So to come on that. The thing I wanted to say about this is, first of all, if you get to functional zero, everyone has been housed, right? So there's no disparate outcome there, but how you get there is important. And there's a lot of communities that haven't gotten to functional zero, and we want to make sure that this initiative is not a way of just focusing on the easiest to house families, which many systems perceive as being white families. I think the value of it shows up with respect to race is that it allows you to be specific about how racism is showing up in your community, in your system. So what I mean by that is I was working with a community in the US that in the wake of June of 2020 decided that racism was bad and decided that they wanted to work on it. And they did all the things that everyone does. They put together a work group, they hired outside experts, they thought about it a lot, and after about a year, nothing had really happened. Then they looked at their data, and they found that although they were being pretty damn equal at placing white folks and brown folks and Black folks into housing at the same rates, the Black and brown folks were falling out of housing way, way, way more frequently than the white folks were. The system was designed to keep the white folks housed. It was not designed to keep the Black and brown folks housed. That was their particular challenge. And again, like Chattanooga, they were able to focus their attention on that particular story. So they weren't as worried about some of the intake methods, right, that they were doing, because they were getting folks moved through that housing system at the same rates. But they were worried about the stabilization supports that they were providing. They were worried about the system of care around Black and brown folks when they were placed into housing, because that's what their data showed them was the issue in their particular community. And to me, the message there is that if you as a person or you as a community try to tackle racism, like in your state, racism in your community, racism in the US, you're gonna be at that work a long time, and racism is gonna die well after you do. But if you're able to break it down into the specific ways in which it's showing up in your community, you might actually be able to do something about it.
You mentioned one of the goals is to tackle visible homelessness first, to build credibility and to say, now that we tackle that, we can begin tackling our other problems. How do you take the messaging from, because there will folks who will say, I don't see any visible homelessness, the problem is solved, please don't tackle me anymore. Exactly. How do you, although you've built credibility by solving the visible problem, how do you continue to fund your programs to tackle the invisible population?
I guess I should be clear, especially because this is being recorded, that part one of what I talked about, the Built for Zero stuff, Community Solutions is opinion. Parts 2 through 4, my opinion. And I did send it to our comms team, so they've read it. But I should be really clear about that this is my perspective. I don't know. I think this is my theory, that when the public narrative is not about crime is going up in our city, homelessness is going up in our city, Seattle is dying, that we will be able to elect people who are running on progressive platforms, that are running on housing and services. I don't think that left of center politicians, if we've solved visible homelessness, are going to stop thinking that it is important to fund shelter programs or permanent supportive housing programs or those things. I just don't believe that to be true. But I also can't show you any evidence of that directly right now. I can't say for sure that I'm correct about this. This is just my theory, that right now we're putting ourselves in a position where the frame of the issue is things are getting shittier all the time. And this allows us to elect right-wing politicians who definitely don't want to fund those programs. So I'd rather take my chances with politicians who have voted for these things for generations than take my chances with the folks we're electing now. Oh, thanks. Anyone else? Yeah.
Sure. So cities in particular, like larger cities,
Yeah.
have kind of a long-term housing supply issue that you spoke
Yep.
to, the permanent supportive housing piece of it, and then the short-term temporary
Yep.
sheltering piece to it. In a resource-constrained environment like we're seeing, and long-term, hopefully there are solutions to that. But in our current scenario, how would you advise those larger cities to think about the relationship between those three components outside of what you already said about tackling visible homelessness as hard as you can?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the answer again is I don't know, right? Like I'm just thinking about these things as I go along. But I think I would come back to what I was talking about solutions, not about problems. And I think a solution that we need for all three forms of housing, sort of market rate housing, traditional permanent supportive housing, or other forms of subsidized affordable housing, and then shelter programs, is that when cities try to put them anywhere, people crawl out of the woodwork saying, don't put it there. And we need to solve that problem across all three of those types of housing. And so I would encourage them to try to cite all three forms of those things to allow for quadplexes and sixplexes in all the single family neighborhoods, and encourage them to, if you're at the state level, to invest hugely in the housing trust fund and in all the other forms of financing that we have. And I'd encourage them to say, you can't have a year of public process about turning a parking lot into a safe lot, for RVs, or a sanctioned encampment. Like, we need to have the tools that allow city leaders to say, this is going to be a safe place for people to go, where there's showers, where there's lockers, where there's, treatment services. And so I would encourage them to focus on those barriers that we see coming across, coming up across all those issues, because without progress on those, we're not going to move forward on any of them. And then within that, you can turn a parking lot into a safe lot in a matter of days if you have the right permits for it. A matter of hours if you have the right permits for it. It takes a little bit longer to turn that into PSH, as you all well know. It takes even longer than that to do other things. But we got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time and move forward on all these things. Does that feel satisfying or not at all? Thank you. Anything else? Great. Well, I will let the rest of you leave. Thank you very much.